Hi friends, hello, happy Valentine's Day. I'm going to attempt to upload this on Valentine's Day, so hopefully it actually is Valentine's Day, and if it's not, it is in spirit. So today I wanted to have a whole video dedicated to recommending sapphic romances that you can just, escape into during Valentine's Day, or really any time of the year, honestly. I have quite a few large stacks here, so for the most part I kind of have this separated into romances that are more romance centered, and then some books that are more plot driven but have sapphic characters or like side romance plots. And I'm just gonna tell you what I liked about them, why I recommended them, what tropes are involved, and all of that. I just thought this would be really fun. I've definitely become way more of a romance reader this past year and a half, and it's honestly like such a fun genre that I, never explored beforehand, and it's so fun. So yeah, we're gonna talk about that today. All right, so let's just get into it. The first book I have here is The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics. Now, this one is very well loved. Honestly, I feel like this is one of my favorite books of all time and one of my favorite romance books of all time. It was just so well done, so great. So let me explain. Essentially, this book follows these two characters, Catherine and Lucy, that's her name, and it follows them in the 18th century. So it's very dated, it's very historical. And something I love about this book is that I went into it really nervous that there was gonna be a lot of just conflict because of the time period that this is set in, but it really doesn't center that at all. It really centers these women's relationships and their careers and their goals, and it's so well done. I really appreciate that there's no like big miscommunication in this book. I will say there's a bit of like the jealousy trope that happens here, but I just think everything was really resolved well in this book, and it had a perfect ending, and the writing was beautiful. It's one of my favorites. The next book we have here is Hairpin Curves. This book is so fun. It's so romance centered. It has the amazing trope of friends to enemies to lovers. It follows these two girls, Megan and Scarlett, and they were old friends, and they get invited to one of their old mutual friends' wedding, and they basically decide to road trip there because neither of them can afford a flight, and so they take this whole road trip together, and they haven't seen or talked to each other in years, and so stuff happens. They really just reconnect over the road trip, and it's so good. I read this in 2 days. This is just one of those books that you can't put down. I'll say too, what I like a lot about this book is that it's sort of slow burn, but it gives you stuff along the way. This also does have the one bed trope. I mean, like, it's just so good. I've also never heard anyone ever talk about this book before or after I've read it, so I think this one deserves more attention. Next we have the infamous One Last Stop, and this one I just wanted to throw in there because this is very romance centric. So this book follows August and Jane. August just moves to New York City in the beginning of this book, and Jane is trapped on the subway, and she is from the 70s. So it has a little bit of this like magical realism aspect. And they meet on the subway, and August recognizes after a while that she keeps seeing Jane on the subway, and then they kind of just form this connection. I will say it's really unique in the fact that like the whole subway thing is happening and Jane isn't from this time, and so they're trying to communicate, but they're also like, they're not from the same time, so that makes it much more complicated. This one was really fun. I also really enjoy that this book includes other queer characters that are like involved in her friend group, so this is a good one. Next we have Satisfaction Guaranteed, and this one is so fun and so good. Basically it follows these two women as they sort of inherit a sex toy shop, and this has an opposites attract trope, which is really fun to read. I never really read anything like that before, but these two characters are so different, but they come together and complement each other in such a great way. This book is very sex positive. Both of the characters are so lovable, and this is just such a great one. The next book we have here is something to talk about. This book is very underrated in my opinion. It follows Emma and Joe. Joe is a screenwriter and Emma's her assistant, so it also has this kind of age gap trope. And something happens to make the public think that they're in a sort of secret relationship. So the play on that is so fun because these two characters do kind of develop feelings for one another, but they're trying not to or to deny those feelings because everyone thinks they're together. And like I said, this is a very slow burn, but it's so well done. It's so satisfying. It's so good. The next book we have here is I Kissed a Girl. This book is pretty fun. It's about this girl, Noah, who is a makeup artist, and this other girl, Lila, who's an actress, and they are working on set together and then they form feelings. It's interesting because Noah was actually like a fan of Lila's beforehand, so she already has this like crush, and then it just kind of follows them like throughout making this movie that they're making. This is another one where it's like, should we be together even though we have these feelings? Like maybe we should deny them type of thing. And I really think the setting of this and the circumstances surrounding it are just really fun. This also follows Lila as she's kind of beginning to come out, which you don't often see in romance novels. I feel like, at least for me, they're usually like already out, so that's kind of interesting to see as Lila's like this public figure who isn't necessarily out yet. Next we have the falling in love montage. Now this follows two girls in high school. This is a YA, Saoirse and Ruby, and they have an interesting sort of dynamic. I will say this one wasn't my favorite. It did kind of fall into a little bit more of a side plot, but it does follow this really cutesy like falling in love montage, basically because they meet each other and they like each other, but they don't want to commit, so they essentially agree to just do all the cutesy falling in love things that they do in falling in love montages in movies over the summer, and then to just like break it off. But obviously things get more complicated than that. They develop feelings for each other, so it's a lot. But I really did think the romance in this was cute, and I really liked the character Ruby. I will say too, this definitely was on the mature side of sapphic YA romances, which I did appreciate. Next we have Honey Girl, which I will say the romance in this for me is more of a side plot. This follows our main character Grace as she's like about to graduate school and she's debating what to do with her life, and it's more of a coming of age story. But along the way she does at some point go to Vegas and accidentally marries this woman in Vegas. So that is part of the coming of age story, is she's like, who did I marry? Who is my wife? And they do eventually meet and form an actual relationship, and it is really sweet. I really like the love interest in this book too. Her name is Yuki and she runs a podcast. She's very creative and she's from New York, and I feel like this is another great example of opposites attract because Grace is this like put together Virgo, and her and Yuki at first just really don't appear to live similar lives, but it's really great because I feel like she definitely breaks Grace out of her shell a bit and shows her that you don't have to be super conventional to be happy, and it's just a really sweet romance between the two. Next I have the Written in the Stars trilogy. We've got Written in the Stars, Hang the Moon, and Count Your Lucky Stars. So I just recently read Count Your Lucky Stars. This just came out, and I do feel like this might be my favorite in this series. So let's go over all of them real quick. So first, in Written in the Stars, we follow Elle and Darcy, and this has the fake dating trope, which is my favorite. Elle and Darcy are set up together and they don't hit it off at first, but then they decide to fake date for certain reasons, and they do end up, you know, it's a romance. They end up falling for each other and it's super cute. It's so adorable. Next we have Hang the Moon. Now this one follows Annie and Brendan is Darcy's brother from the first book, and Annie is Darcy's best friend. So back in the day, Brendan had a huge crush on Annie, and then they haven't seen each other in years, or have been like, they haven't been very close in years. And then Annie comes to visit Darcy and sparks start flying. Now, while this isn't a sapphic romance, Annie is a sapphic main character. She's bi and she talks about it pretty frequently. So I do really love how this second book really solidifies the friend group in this book, because it's honestly one of the best parts that they're all like friends. And that brings me to the third book, where we follow Margot and Olivia. So Margot is Elle's roommate and best friend from college, and Margot also becomes really good friends with Brendan. So the five of them, Margot, Annie, Brendan, Darcy, and Elle, are like this little friend group. So essentially, one of the previous couples is about to get married, and Olivia is their wedding planner. So when this friend group goes to meet the wedding planner, Olivia, Margot and Olivia already know each other. This is a second chance romance. Margot and Olivia were childhood best friends to lovers, and then things happened and it got broken off and they hadn't talked to each other in 11 years. This also has the forced proximity trope, because Olivia ends up being like out of a living situation, and so Margot has an open room in her apartment, and she ends up having to offer it to Olivia in front of all her friends, because it would just be a dick move not to. But all her friends don't know her and Olivia's past, so it's like super kind of awkward for the both of them, but they just do it because they have no other choice. What I do really like about this book is that they were best friends at one point, so even though they had this sort of falling out, they do still know each other to their core, which I think is fun to play with in a romance, because they've been so distant and they have these feelings, but they don't necessarily know if they should act on them or if the other has feelings anymore. And it's just super cute. It was such a great end to this trilogy. I'm gonna miss it so much. I wish there were more books. The next book I have here is Dead Girls. Now this romance is definitely more of a side plot. This follows more of a mystery, but what is so unique about this book is that it's set in Harlem in 1926, but our main character does have a girlfriend. And I just thought this romance was so well done in this time period specifically. When it comes to sapphic historical fiction, you definitely get more of a sense of like this pining and this longing, because they're together but they can't really be together, which can be entertaining to read. I feel like also just reading how historically these relationships would be maintained and would be navigated is really interesting. But I just really loved the romance in this book, especially because our main character is going through so much in like the plot, that her girlfriend really is this, you know, rock for her and this person that she leans on at the end of the day, which I found really sweet. The next book we have is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. If you know, you know. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the best sapphic stories to date. This is another one where it's historical. It's set in the 50s, so these two women aren't really out when they're together, and that kind of really changes the story. And the fact that these women are both famous and in the public eye definitely has a lot to do with them not being out. And obviously this story does center around Evelyn's 7 husbands, but what I do love is that this sapphic romance really is the highlight of this book, the center of this book, the core, if you will. I just think this was so well done, and the fact that like at the end of the day, even though Evelyn had all these relationships with these men and her husbands, her most significant relationship was with a woman. Obviously this book doesn't need more hype. It has all the hype it deserves, but it is definitely worthwhile. It is so good. So now I'm going to be getting into more sapphic fantasy, but I did want to throw in the Legend of Korra comics. And I wanted to throw these in because these are when they start exploring Korra and Asami's relationship much more. In the TV show, their relationship is very, very subtle. So the comics are where they shine. They are so good. And they're very explicitly together in the comics, which I appreciate. And I just love both of these comics. They're so great. Staying in the Avatar universe, the next one we have here is The Rise of Kiyoshi and the Shadow of Kiyoshi. And obviously a lot of this book is about Avatar Kiyoshi exploring her avatarhood for the first time. But she does this alongside her best friend and lover, Rangi. And I think this romance was so well navigated and so beautifully written and subtle in the way that felt realistic. But again, they are explicitly together in this. They have romantic scenes together, and I just thought it was so sweet and precious. Next, we have another duology, which is These Witches Don't Burn and This Coven Won't Break. This duology is really cute. It mostly centers this plot about witches and like the magic system and everything, but it does have a lot of sapphic characters. It has a lot of queer characters in general, which is appreciated. I would say the second book is more romance heavy. The first book is kind of dealing with the main character who just got out of a relationship and then kind of is getting into another romance. But the second book definitely explores that more. And while romance is a side plot in both of these books, it was really well done and really wholesome and really cool to see in this type of universe. This book also sort of follows this trope where, I'm not sure exactly what you would call it, but it reminds me of like Romeo and Juliet, where like they're not supposed to want to be together because they're on like these opposing sides, but they do end up being together. Next, from the same author actually, is The Coldest Touch, and this is quite an interesting one. This follows a vampire and a human with magical abilities. So this follows Claire the vampire as she is going to try and almost mentor and shepherd Elise, who is having these magical abilities. And it's honestly really scary. Elise's ability is that she can touch anyone and see their death, and she fully experiences it and she does not like it. She is not into it. But then Claire comes to help her and explain her ability and make it a little easier for her, and they do end up forming this sort of relationship because they're a part of this same world, if you will. I will say the romance in this does kind of feel like a side plot to me as well. This is much more centered on Elise's ability and her discovering it and her discovering how to handle it. But I do think the romance was really sweet and it was a really fun part of this book. Okay, so these last 4 books are 4 of my favorite books of all time, so bear with me. The first 2 are Criers War and Iron Heart. This is a duology, and these books were just everything, you guys. Criers War follows Crier and Ayla, and it follows them in this different universe basically where these Automa people are basically in charge rather than humans, and these people are sort of like, you know, machines, if you will. I don't know how else to really describe them, because they're made rather than born, and they were created by humans, but then eventually they kind of like took over, and they're kind of like represented as these like not compassionate people at all and just like the complete opposite of humans. And they have a past of treating humans really badly. Like, that's why they're in charge. They kind of destroyed humanity in a way. But this follows Crier, who's kind of like a princess to this land. Her father is in charge and she's like set to be in charge next. And Ayla is just a human who's lost everything to these Automa, and she despises them. They just took her whole life and her whole family from her, and she hates Crier's father because he's like the ruler, and so she really wants to get to him by destroying Crier. But they get into this circumstance where they have to be together, and Ayla is kind of like Crier's servant, kind of like right-hand girl, and they end up forming like a much more emotional bond than either of them were expecting, especially because anime are like known to be perfect and to be made perfectly, to not have the weaknesses of humans like emotions, and Crier is not like that. Like, Crier does feel things. And what's so compelling about this book is that Crier knows she's like not supposed to be feeling these things, but she does, and they both kind of witness this happening and are confused. So it is just so fun, so sweet. This world building is amazing. I thought this world was just so interesting, and it just gets even better in Ironheart. So this is just one of my favorite duologies ever. Next we have This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is so good. This book is so hard to get into. Warning, it is so hard to get into. But this book follows these two characters, Red and Blue, who are basically on opposite sides of a war, and they start communicating through a bunch of different ways. It's very futuristic and sci-fi, so it's kind of hard to explain how they communicate, but they kind of communicate through these like threads of, I would say, like kind of threads of different universes, if you will. And they communicate by sending each other letters. And these letters are like the most beautiful, well done pieces of writing I've ever read. They're seriously so captivating, so just like beautiful. Like, I can never understand how someone wrote this. And the pining and yearning happening in this is like no other. And like I said, they're on opposite sides of a war, so the two people, or the two governments that are like in charge of them, find out that this is happening and want it to end. So it becomes really devastating, and this like really embodies Romeo and Juliet like so much. They are very much not supposed to be talking to each other, let alone understanding one another and forming this sort of bond together. And so they kind of like defy their governments, but also kind of follow what they say. It becomes very complicated, but it is so well done. The last book I have here, and a very recent new favorite of mine, is The Space Between Worlds. This book honestly blows my mind with how well it was written and how well this world was built. Oh my god, it's so impressive. This basically follows a universe in which multi-dimensional travel is now possible. And so in this universe, there's basically, to simplify it, there's like a poor side of this community and then a really rich side. And the really rich side is where they, go to do the multi-universe travel. And so it follows this main character, Korra, and she comes from the poor side, but she lives now on the wealthier side to do this travel, because basically you can only go to these other worlds if your doppelganger on that world is already dead. So they have to basically exploit these people who in other universes would have a more likely chance of being dead to do this travel for them. So this follows Korra, who is a traverser, going to these other worlds and getting this information for them. And it also follows her watcher, Del. And by watcher, I sort of mean like she's the one pulling her to go into other worlds and like talking to her in her ear and, helping her along the way. And her and Del have this sort of relationship. It's really interesting because it's like this relationship where they both like each other, but they won't really give in. And it's kind of that thing where you're watching them being like, come on, guys. But it's also really interesting because Korra thinks that Del doesn't like her because she's from like the poor side of this community. and she thinks it's all like rooted in Dell's classism. But it's really interesting because that idea of korras is definitely more debunked, and it's kind of explained more in this this idea that this author brings, that you can't really ever fully know anybody, even yourself. And so even though Korra and Dell know each other so closely and spend so much time together, and Korra thinks that Dell has this internal bias, it doesn't really actually add up that way. And I would definitely say this romance is a lot more of a side plot as well, but this book is so incredible. I literally felt like I was watching multiple movies, like movie after movie. Like, I can't even believe how much was in this book in its short span. It was one of those things where even though they weren't explicitly together the whole time, you could tell there was a deep caring and understanding between the two, and they did a lot for each other. Like, they were not just romantic partners, they were best friends. This one is just such a great new favorite of mine. I'm obsessed with it. I can't even like wrap my head around how good this was. And that is all the sapphic romance recs I have for you guys today. I'm so giddy just like talking about all these, truly. I think what's just so great about literature is that it's so much more, I want to say it's so much more broadly representational when it comes to like LGBTQ characters, and just like characters that are, you know, in marginalized corners. I just definitely feel like there's way more stories out there for queer people in books rather than media these days. And granted, I mean, media's getting a lot better, but the creativeness of the stories in books is just, it's just so wonderful. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you pick one of these up for Valentine's Day, or honestly anytime you're in the mood to just feel a little love, feel a little romantic. I obviously highly recommend all of these books, so let me know if you've read any of them or if you're interested in reading any of them and what you guys think. But that is all for me today. Thank you guys so much for being here and hanging with me, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye guys!